I'm so excited to be moderating this incredible panel. Just to introduce myself, my name is Fernande Raine. I was at Ashoka for a very long time, worked there for 15 years in various roles and obligations around the globe, and then started my own endeavor around the role of history teaching, because I always felt like history was something that was important to help young people see their role in the world. And I am incredibly excited to have the opportunity to work with all three of these young people who are leading efforts in multiple layers of efforts around this issue of history and empowering young people through stories, through narratives, through an understanding of the past and a vision for the future. And so I would love to introduce to you Anya Dua, who lives in Florida and was a New Yorker before she was in Florida, but has always been someone very passionate about the identity questions for Generation Z. Victor Ye is from California, lives in Los Angeles, and is someone I met last year in India in a very unlikely spot. But I had the opportunity to hear about the incredible work that he's been doing, and so will you in a second. And Jana Amin, who is Egyptian American and based in Boston, but currently in Cairo. And so tuning in from the middle of the night, nothing is ever too late for a Ashoka event. So welcome all three of you. And let's kick off this event that we framed this way because there's so many ways that history can be either incredibly boring in school and become something that's oppressive and awful, or it can be something that's really inspiring. So I wanted to start with a question for all three of you to talk a little bit about your own experience in history class with regards to this question of narrative and identity. And so share a little bit more about who you are, and then dive into this question, if you would, about the connection for you between your own story and your own identity and the way you were engaging with this in school. So Anya, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So personally, I don't really know where to start. It's a big question, but I'll just jump into it. I think one of the most impactful experiences and things that I've learned about in history class was in 9th grade. I was studying 20th century world history. And it was a time when just everything was changing with geopolitics. And I just find it so fascinating because I really can see how that has impacted the world today. But also more personally, before learning about 20th century world history, I really didn't know too much about the partition in India. And my dad, my dad is Indian, I'm half Indian, and my grandparents, they used to live in Lahore, and then during the partition they moved to Delhi, and I never really knew much about that, and I didn't really understand their experience. And we read a lot of different primary sources about the partition, and it was just really insightful, and I felt like I had a much greater connection to the event, and that sparked an even greater interest in it. And to this year, during a comparative government project, I decided to interview students in Pakistan because I wanted to further understand that. And so that was really impactful for me. And I think the biggest thing that contributed to that experience was the ability to a couple of things. First, I really liked how we read a lot of primary sources from different sides of each historical instance. From, in World War II, we read sides from Germans, we read sides from Americans, just really getting that full picture. So the textbook reading was almost secondary to the primary sources that we read and the discussions we had. And then the other thing was how we wrote analytical essays on the topic, because I love writing essays and researching for them, and I think it just furthers our understanding. So yeah.
Awesome, thank you so much. Victor, do you want to take it over? You're next on my screen, so I'm going to pivot right to you.
Of course, yeah. So I'm Victor. I am a first-generation Chinese American. My parents are immigrants from China. And growing up, they never really learned to speak English. So for someone like myself, living in the suburbs of Los Angeles, I realized that there's a critical need for me to not only be assimilated to American society, but also to embrace my roots as someone that was from another culture and background. However, I didn't see it, represented in schools as well. And I thought that, for myself as a first-generation American, I needed to contribute as much as I can to the society because I, after all, have been born on American soil and am an American citizen. So being able to have the privilege of having parents come over here from so far away, but yet having the experience of experiencing American education and then also being involved in the daily communities of diverse people always motivates me to at least come into the area of solving world issues. However, the biggest experience that I've gained from history is to realize that history is a flowing subject that cannot be limited by the textbook. I know that, for me, the one moment that sparked my interest in actually diving more into history building and also civic engagement was in my sophomore year of high school when I was taking a European history course. When we were talking about the French Revolution, we talked a lot about different mistakes that were being made in the past. And at the time and period, I loved reading current events and issues. And that particular moment in time was during the crisis of the Venezuelans. And their economy was crashing. People were not living in well circumstances. And I just continued to reflect upon how the history that we were learning was in fact factual and also based off of old historical events, but that we weren't able to apply what we learned from the classroom experience into those real world problems that could be solved. So I actually asked my teacher during a French Revolution debate, we can actually take the applications of what we learned from the French and the kings and then also the oppression of monarchies into the same realm that Venezuelans were actually experiencing. And my teacher told me that because it was not going to be tested on the curriculum, we didn't need to learn it, first of all, and also second of all, that there were people on the ground solving the issue already, and they had jobs for it. So young people like us didn't need to worry about those type of issues. And from that particular period on, that really reflected a huge importance and need for me to at least get involved in some sort of way to help students realize that their impact is so much more systemic, especially coming from a privileged place like ourselves in America, where we can honestly work with people from all walks of life and actually be able to provide all our experiences through different lens and perspectives into the ways in which we can help provide as much experience and as much solutions as possible to the greatest problems of the century.
Thank you so much, Victor. Jana, you're up next.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree, I think, with what both Victor and Anya have said thus far. I grew up in Egypt before immigrating to the US. And, now I've become kind of this Egyptian American activist who's incredibly passionate about gender parity efforts, the inclusion of young women in peacemaking and decision-making spaces, and changing the narrative around Muslim women. And I think all of my activism is very much, informed by my experience with history education in the past. Both in Egypt and when I moved to the US, I never learned about some of the role models that I think I was very much yearning for. So Muslim women who were empowered, who were making change in their communities, and making sure that that change was reflected at every level of society, so not just kind of among the elites. And I found that, I never learned about a single Muslim woman, both in Egypt and in the US, while there were tons of Muslim women who are out there throughout history and in the present day who are making incredible change in our world. And so I think when I kind of started to do my own history research, understand, what rights Islam did give to women in kind of early times and what that looked like and how that legacy carried through with Muslim women throughout history, that was when I really started understanding and realizing the importance of history education that was reflective of the people who are learning it. It's so hard to see yourself as a change maker, as someone who is going to create positive impact in our world, if you don't see role models like yourself throughout history. Even though those role models were there, their accomplishments, their achievements, and their contributions were just not celebrated as much as they deserved. And so I think I'm super excited to be here talking with you all because I really truly believe that the only way to empower our future generations is to ensure that the history they're being taught is reflective of who they are and all their various identities.
That is the perfect segue into the next question, which is how have you been active outside of school in advancing some of these issues and taking action with your knowledge of history, writing papers, and then turning around to turn it into something concrete? We can do a reverse order. Jana, you want to just build up on what you had just said, and then we'll roll back the way via Victor to Anya.
Yeah, so following my freshman year of high school, I took on a research project around Princess Fawzia, who was the sister of the last king of Egypt, King Farouk, and was an incredible woman who was portrayed in international media as being a political pawn, someone who had very little rights and almost no voice, and yet in national media was hailed as this, icon who helped galvanize rights for women and children, opened a variety of health clinics across Egypt, and was very much the role model for Egyptian women at the time. And so looking into the past and finding this woman who, in many ways, had incredible contributions to society, but just wasn't celebrated for them in international media, that was a real turning point for me in my own understanding of my role in the world. And so I then, created an exhibit around Princess Fawzia at the American University in Cairo. Young people from around the world have visited that exhibit, and as have adults, and they've been learning about that history, understanding that they do play a role in creating change in our society. And from there, I've really tried to use Princess Fawzia's story and the stories of so many Muslim women throughout history, and so many women generally throughout history that have been kind of erased from our textbooks to bring light to some of these women and ensure that we are changing the narrative around Muslim women to give them the the attention and the love and the care that they deserve.
Awesome. Thank you, Jana. Anya, over to you.
Yeah, so particularly with history, we all worked on untextbooks together, and I particularly chose the book called These Truths. And it was a big read, 1,000 pages. And I thought that it was really, really interesting because I had just taken an AP US history course, and I basically just knew a series of events and didn't really, understand many like themes about history, and reading that book really, really opened my eyes about it. And the reason why I'm particularly interested in reading a book about US history is because I started my own organization called the Gen Z Identity Lab. And that's particularly focused on American teenagers, American Gen Zers. Gen Zers are from around like 13 right now to 23. So I am super passionate about this, not only because I'm a member of Gen Z, but also because right now is a time when Gen Zers are going into college, starting to be able to vote, going into the workforce. And I just don't think that's getting the attention that it deserves. And I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding of Gen Zers. And, just as older generations put millennials into boxes and said all millennials are lazy and like avocado toast, they're also trying to put Gen Zers into different boxes. And I think that's really limiting, and it doesn't really come necessarily from a place of knowledge of actual data and research about Gen Zers and conversations with Gen Zers. And so that's really what I'm trying to foster and uplift through the Gen Z Identity Lab, where we do research on what Gen Zers think on different current event issues, and share that research through infographics on our social media, and ultimately share them with news sources. We've been in Forbes and the New York Times right now, and I'm just really trying to get our name out there more and more to get the research to people who are in positions of influence and to get that Gen Z voice heard. So I am really excited to talk to other passionate Gen Zers.
Thank you, Anya. Victor.
Yeah, I know that all of Jenna's and Anya's work has been super remarkable and is lasting a huge impact on young people like ourselves. I know that for me, right after that experience that I had mentioned earlier, I felt compelled at least to start something that was beyond my school community, because I felt that every student that I was talking to when I was going to various conferences and summits were experiencing the same issue, that they actually wanted to explore a passion of theirs to a deeper level, but were stuck by the classroom experience and the regurgitation and memorization of information that only kind of prohibited them from actually diving deeper into what they could see as problem-solving mechanisms for society. And that's when I started the project called InnovYouth, which is the words innovate and youth put together. And we are a 501c3 education organization that helps students start their own social impact projects. And we hosted conferences around social responsibility, civic engagement, and as well as global leadership. It was initially supposed to be a community initiative just to combat the various problems that were existed in my school community. And I know in the first year when I was a sophomore in high school, it was definitely a challenge because I had events where only about 5 people showed up, or all the way to like 20 people. And then we often were facing a lot of barriers when it came to young people being able to present in front of different stages and in workshops. But I know that, after kind of working through the kind of a series of events throughout the years, we ended up expanding exponentially by the time that I was a senior. When we started operating in about a dozen countries and 15 different states, hosting over 50 conferences and events and workshops worldwide. And we partnered with places from the Dubai Youth Hub all the way to the Iranian city governments, all the way to the Department of Education here in Los Angeles as well. So I know that throughout this experience, just like Jana and Anna have done with their own individual projects, we don't really have a limit to what we can do. And I think that's why we feel super compelled to do even more to achieve something that we believe will help more individuals really see the sense of what it means for people to be involved and get ready to, make a difference in their own society.
As you're saying, reaching a broader audience and lots of people. Victor, it's a perfect transition to the project that the three of you created together, which is something that is poised to reach many kids around the world and adults. Can you talk a little bit about the podcast the three of you made called Untextbooked, and how did it come to be and what's it about?
Yeah, of course. I think, Fernanda, you're going to be in the family tree, the mother nature of all of the birth of ideas or people and connections and networks. I think, the first time that we met in India with a Ashoka related summit, we really talked a conversation through breakfast about a lot about history. And I know that we were both frustrated. You as someone that went through history as an academic subject, and me as someone through high school. And we really saw the resonance when it came to realizing that our American democracy is actually quite fragile many times. And in many ways and shapes and forms, it does not truly represent all diverse walks of life when it comes to people like ourselves. I know that, for example, Anya and Jenna and I all come from different backgrounds and walks of life and different parts of the US as a fundamental beginning. And so I think Fernanda and I started to realize that we maybe needed to actually start something to affect more young people and help them realize that there's an identity for them in history, and that, if we really share the common mutual understanding of our cultural heritage, our backgrounds, and also what we were passionate about when it came to history, that we would actually be able to actually fix a lot of the issues that are current here in the US. So we kind of came up with a podcast as a main mechanism and effective communicative effort to really bring across a conversation that was really something that was not, prohibitive of a barrier, because I know that a lot of times resources may be only given to those who can access it. And we knew that the podcast form was easy. We could be able to upload it to Spotify, to Apple Podcasts, and anyone with a device could be able to access it. And I know that, Fernanda, with her amazing network, reached out to Jenna and Anya, and here we are as three individuals who are all from different projects, all from different passions and interests. And here we are working on this bigger, grander initiative, aiming to help transform the way history would be taught inside the classroom experience. And hopefully getting students to realize that history is not just a subject for nerds or fanatics, or just a way for actually history to be involved in every person's life as a way for us to understand people better.
It's an awesome intro to the podcast, which you all, by the way, have to check out. I'll put it into the chat, or someone can put it into the chat while I'm talking. Jana, can you talk a little bit about what it was like to make this podcast, and what kind of people you brought together, and what sort of was special about it from the experience of you participating in it?
Yeah, definitely. So basically, the main idea behind the podcast is that each episode features a Gen Zer teenager and a qualified historian who can talk about kind of, an issue that they both find interesting. And so myself, I interviewed Professor Laila Ahmed from the Harvard Divinity School on veiling practices throughout history, and looking at, the role of Muslim women in white feminism and how kind of those go back and forth between each other. And so, the real focus and the idea, and I think the belief that the podcast is centered around, is the importance of intergenerational conversations in driving change and making history education better. So often we hear, historians talk in fancy language. It's very inaccessible to young populations. which is why we believe that having intergenerational conversations is a really important way to make history education more interesting for everybody involved, but also spark the dialogue that we need, where, you know, qualified experts who understand their issue in depth and have, you know, spent years and years and years studying these issues can then talk with young people and make it, you know, demonstrate the importance of that issue. And so all 17 of our, I think it's 17, all 17 of our episodes are out now. And so you can definitely go and take a look at them. But if you're an educator, if you're a parent, if you have any teens in your network, but if you're a teen yourself, we definitely encourage you to listen to the podcast and share it with your community, because I think we truly believe that these intergenerational conversations will be what would spark the change that we need to see in the world today.
Awesome. Thank you, Jana. And Anya, could you round it up before we leave some minutes for some questions from our wonderful collaborators in this conversation about what you think the impact of the podcast can be, and what your hopes were for in terms of the impact that you will be able to have as you expand it over time?
Yeah, so my personal goal, and I think is also the goal of the rest of the team and Fernanda, is that we are all people who have been incredibly lucky to have access to a lot of history materials. And, you know, textbooks are the basic that everybody has across the country, but that's really not what makes a history education impactful, what makes it stick with you, what makes you remember and absorb the material well. And I think I've definitely experienced that, and many people experience that as well. And so really our goal is to bring a more higher level educational materials like our podcast to people who wouldn't normally have access to those materials, who maybe think that it's sort of too advanced and not very attainable for them, but we're putting it in a very accessible and relevant format, which will draw people towards it and also make it seem a little bit less intimidating, and really share that idea that history is for everyone and everyone has a place in history, and everyone can see themselves and should be able to see themselves in the history that they learn. And so that's what's really important to me, and I think to the rest of the team.
Not to toot your guys' horn, but I will toot your guys' horn because it's fantastic. So this little crazy podcast that was started with $0 in our pocket, but big dreams and an aggressive timeline of working while we were raising money, managed to get an award from Spotify to be one of the top 4 podcasts picked out of 5,000 podcasts for sort of the next wave of youth podcasting last week. And so Spotify is putting all sorts of resources into making a new logo and branding and spreading this out. And all of us were like, that's crazy. That is not what we thought was going to happen for a history podcast, but we're pretty excited to see what will come out of all that. But just kudos to these 3 and the other 12 that are part of this team, because they've done an absolutely incredible job. So over to the rest of you, questions to these fantastic leaders. I've taken too much time already talking.
Well, firstly, thank you to all 3 speakers. Amazing. And I agree with Marina that you guys have an amazing language and vocabulary to explain all that you're doing. What are some of the challenges you faced while you started working in these realms? I'll just keep it open, so if anyone would like to jump in.
I can jump in. Oh, sorry, Jenna, if you, I was just gonna say, I think for me, like it was a little tricky to learn how to network with people at first. And that's really how like all of these things get started and get off the ground. And I learned, especially through the Gen Z Identity Lab, I just created a Google spreadsheet of all the people that I talked to about the Gen Z Identity Lab. And I put their email there and made sure to update them about what we were doing as a way to sort of keep them updated with what the operations have been. And I feel like that has given me incredibly valuable life skills. And it was also a big challenge at the beginning, not getting answers from everybody. And then 1 month, I just got, everybody just started responding to me, and I was like completely overwhelmed, but I was really exciting. And it was a challenge, but I think it's been very educational.
I would definitely want to add on Anya's point as well. I know that one of the biggest challenges that maybe we had experience too is actually facing a historian who had so much expertise in their field, many decades of probably research and also scholar efforts. And here we are as 16 to 18-year-olds trying to interview someone from another period of time about their work and field of study. And so I know that for me, I wanted to discover more about American society and what the American dream meant for people here in the US. So I ended up interviewing and read the book Leaders, Myth, and Reality, who's the author of General Stanley McChrystal, who was one of the military generals who led forces against Al Qaeda during the Obama administration. And I would tell you how nervous I was before the interview to be able to speak to someone at that caliber and talk about what it meant for him to go from ground zero all the way to his public service career, and also talk a little bit more about what it meant for us to be American citizens and what it means for us to be patriotic and also someone that loves our country, but yet also needs to grapple with the history of our past. And so throughout that experience, I think we've really learned a lot about what it means for intergenerational conversation. And I think that beyond that, being able to experience what it means for us to be able to be educated, but also to work alongside those who really have made an effort in our society to make things better for not only our generation, but also future generations as well.
I always find myself nodding as Victor and Anya are speaking, because I totally agree with everything they've said thus far. I think, the last kind of challenge that I'd add is that any work that you do as a young person often has the, potential of someone saying, you're a young person, we're not going to take this seriously. And I think, adults have that influence and power, regarding what Anya was saying in terms of networking, to be able to uphold and uplift and believe in the work that you are doing. So as a young person, I feel like there have been many, opportunities and instances where older generations have said that, this idea doesn't have validity or doesn't have merit, et cetera. But I think the overwhelming number of times that people have supported and uplifted the work that we're all doing with Untextbooked especially has really created kind of some of the incredible opportunities that we're able to bring to you all today, but also the podcast that we're able to share with the world more generally.
Thank you for those insights.
And thank you everyone for joining us at this late hour, at really late hour in some parts of the world. Thank you to our Canadian outposts for joining us from up north. And just in general, thank you to the three of you for leading one of the best sessions that I've been to at an Ashoka U event. And I've been there for a very long time. You are so visionary and articulate. I feel so privileged to be able to learn from you and alongside you and to work with you. It is just, I can't stop smiling anytime that you guys are talking and nodding and smiling because I'm just such an admirer of the work that you all do, and am excited that Ashoka and all the adults that are in this kind of community, I really do believe in supporting you and in helping you and in making everything that you are doing come to fruition. So thank you, thank you. Keep at it, and may you find other connections throughout this Ashoka network that will help your work grow. Thank you for taking this time to share your thoughts and your passions and your impact with us, your vision, and have a fantastic rest of your evening. Thank you to our listeners and participants, and thank you, Marina.